There's a particular kind of quiet that doesn't come from peace. It comes from learning very early that sound doesn't travel far, that when you send something outward, it doesn't always come back. So you learn to keep things close, tucked in, managed internally. You don't remember deciding to do this. You just remember the feeling of stopping. It starts as a pause. A moment where you consider saying something and then don't, not because it's dangerous, not because it's forbidden, but because there's a vague sense that it won't land anywhere useful. The pause becomes familiar, comfortable even. Silence turns into a default setting. From the outside, this quiet looks impressive, calm, composed. You're the one who doesn't need much, the one who doesn't ask for attention, the one who seems independent beyond your years. People admire this about you. They call you mature, grounded, low maintenance. What they don't see is the constant internal activity, the way thoughts loop inward instead of outward, the way emotions rise and are immediately redirected, processed privately, filed away without witness. You don't explode, you don't collapse, you contain. Containment becomes a skill. You get good at it. So good that you stop noticing you're doing it. There's a sensation that accompanies this skill, a subtle tightening, like keeping a lid on something that might spill if you relax too much. You feel it in moments when others lean on you emotionally and you don't mind. Because you've been holding things for so long, it feels normal. You feel it when people ask how you're doing and you answer honestly, but only with the parts that don't require follow-up. You rarely feel desperate, rarely feel needy. In fact, you might feel slightly confused by people who do. Their urgency feels foreign. Their desire to be seen feels excessive. You don't judge it. You just don't recognize yourself in it. You've learned to be a closed loop. There's a strange comfort in that when nothing goes out. Nothing can be missed on the way back. You become self-sufficient in an emotional sense. You learn how to soothe yourself, distract yourself, reason with yourself. You become your own audience, and yet there are moments when this arrangement feels off. Not painful, just thin, like living in a room with good lighting but no windows. Everything functions, but there's a lack of airflow you can't quite name. These moments often arrive unexpectedly, watching someone else be comforted, seeing a child reach out without hesitation, noticing how easily others lean into support when they're overwhelmed. You don't feel jealous exactly, you feel distant. Like you're observing a behavior you understand intellectually, but not instinctively. You may even pride yourself on not needing much from others, on being the one who doesn't burden, who doesn't require emotional maintenance. This identity feels clean, efficient. It keeps relationships simple, but it also creates an odd imbalance. People come to you, they confide in you, they unload, you listen well, you always have. There's space in you because you made so much of it. What you don't do as easily is reach back. Not because you don't want connection, but because reaching feels unfamiliar. Like speaking a language you never fully learned. There's a hesitation there, a subtle internal check. Is this worth sharing? Will it matter? Will it change anything? Often the answer feels unclear, so you keep it to yourself. Again, you might notice that when something genuinely good happens to you, your first instinct isn't to tell someone. It's to absorb it privately, to enjoy it quietly, as if sharing it might dilute it or make it fragile. The same goes for difficult moments. You handle them internally first, and second, and third. By the time anyone hears about it, the sharp edges have been sanded down. The story sounds manageable, resolved. It rarely reflects the intensity of what actually passed through you. This isn't secrecy, it's containment. You may not even realize how automatic this has become until someone asks you to rely on them, to lean, to let go just a little. The request doesn't feel threatening, it just feels confusing. What would that even look like? What would you hand over? And how would you know it would be held? There's a deep assumption operating quietly underneath all of this, that whatever arises inside you is your responsibility to manage, then involving others is optional, maybe even unnecessary. That strength looks like self-handling. This assumption isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It's just there, shaping your responses, narrowing your range of expression without you noticing the narrowing. You might be described as emotionally steady, unshakable. Hard to read. These descriptions aren't wrong, but they're incomplete. They capture the surface, not the structure. Underneath, there's a constant internal dialogue, a monitoring, an awareness of your own states that doesn't turn outward easily. You feel deeply, but you feel alone with it. Sometimes this aloneness feels like freedom, no dependence, no disappointment, no waiting for someone else to show up in the right way. Other times, it feels like isolation wearing the costume of independence. The confusing part is that nothing obviously bad seems to have happened. There are no dramatic memories, no single moment you can point to and say, that's when it started. The self-containment feels like a personality trait, not a response. You might even wonder if you were simply born this way, naturally reserved, naturally self-sufficient. That explanation is appealing. It doesn't require revisiting anything uncomfortable, but there are cracks in it. Small ones. They appear when you're exhausted but still don't ask for help. When you're overwhelmed but minimize it instinctively. When you feel disconnected in relationships, even though you're present and attentive, they appear in the way you tolerate emotional distance better than emotional unpredictability, in the way you prefer consistency over intimacy, in the way you feel safest when nothing is required of you emotionally. You might notice that closeness sometimes feels intrusive, not because you don't want it, but because it asks something of you that you're not sure how to give. Vulnerability, in the traditional sense, feels oddly performative, exposing without guarantee. So you stay contained. You stay controlled. You stay self-reliant. And it works for a long time. Until one day, you realize that being able to handle everything alone doesn't mean you were ever meant to. That realization doesn't arrive with clarity yet. It arrives as a question you don't know how to answer. Why does needing nothing feel safer than wanting something? The shift begins not with memory, but with reinterpretation. You start to see your self-containment not as a preference, but as a pattern. One that formed quietly, early, without instruction. Here's where the discomfort deepens, because the truth that emerges isn't dramatic. It's subtle. And that subtlety is what makes it unsettling. Emotionally neglected children don't always grow up feeling empty. Many grow up feeling complete on their own, too complete. Closed systems that learned not to expect resonance. Neglect in this sense isn't about absence of care in the obvious ways. It's about the absence of response, about sending something outward and not receiving it back in a form that mirrors, names, or holds it. When this happens repeatedly, the lesson isn't I am unlovable. That lesson is too loud, too obvious. The lesson is quieter. What I feel is something I handle myself. This lesson doesn't feel tragic. It feels practical. So the child adapts. They turn inward. They become self-referential. They learn to regulate their inner world without external calibration. Over time, this becomes identity. As adults, these individuals are often described as extremely self-contained. They don't overshare. They don't collapse. They don't seek reassurance. They don't panic in emotional storms. They look resilient. But this resilience has a cost. The cost is that emotional experience becomes private property, shared selectively, cautiously, if at all. Not because of mistrust, but because there was never evidence that sharing made a difference. This is where emotional distance gets misread. Others may interpret your containment as aloofness or detachment or lack of need. But what they're seeing is not a lack of feeling. It's a lack of expectation. You don't expect to be met emotionally, so you don't extend yourself in that direction. You don't wait. You don't hope. You don't reach. And because expectation is the bridge between inner and outer worlds, that bridge never fully forms. The unsettling truth is that this adaptation worked. It kept you functional. It kept you composed. It allowed you to grow without obvious breakdowns. But it also limited the range of what you could receive. When you don't expect emotional attunement, you don't notice when it's offered. Or if you do, you don't trust it enough to lean into it. You remain self-contained even in safe spaces. This is why Some adults who grew up emotionally neglected feel lonelier in close relationships than in solitude. Solitude matches their internal structure. Closeness asks them to externalize something they've spent a lifetime internalizing. The shutdown you feel in moments of emotional demand isn't a flaw. It's an old strategy surfacing in new contexts. You learned early that staying self-contained was safer than reaching outward without response. That lesson doesn't disappear just because circumstances change. What's unsettling is realizing how deeply this lesson shaped your sense of self. You may feel proud of your independence, and you should. It got you through, but independence born of necessity carries different weight than independence born of choice. One is flexible, the other is rigid. The rigidity shows up when you want connection but don't know how to let yourself need it. When you crave closeness but feel overwhelmed by it. When you're capable of deep empathy for others but struggle to receive it in return. This isn't because you're broken, it's because you were trained indirectly to become emotionally self-contained in an environment where attunement was inconsistent or absent. And here's the part that doesn't get talked about enough. This adaptation often goes unnoticed because it doesn't cause visible dysfunction. You succeed, you function, you manage, you don't ask for much. From the outside, there's no crisis. Inside, there's a quiet ceiling you keep bumping into, a limit to how connected you can feel, no matter how close someone gets. The realization of this ceiling can be disorienting because it suggests that your emotional world has been shaped not just by what happened, but by what didn't. By moments where feelings went unmirrored, where bids for connection weren't answered, where emotional signals disappeared into silence. The adult self doesn't remember these moments clearly, but the pattern remains. Extremely self-contained adults often struggle not with expressing emotion, but with allowing it to be held by someone else. The idea of external containment feels unnecessary at best, threatening at worst. This is why emotional neglect can produce people who appear unaffected, who don't seem wounded, who don't talk about their past. The absence didn't hurt in a way that demanded attention. It simply redirected development inward. And once development goes inward long enough, outward connection feels optional. The unresolved tension here is this. Self-containment protects you from disappointment, but it also protects you from being known. You may not consciously want to be known, but some part of you still longs for resonance, for the experience of being met without having to translate yourself first. That longing doesn't disappear just because you learn to live without it. The unsettling truth is that you can be extremely self-contained and still deeply relational at heart. The containment doesn't erase the desire. It just buries it under competence. And now, as an adult, you're left with a question that doesn't have an immediate answer. What would it mean to let something out without managing it first? There's no instruction manual for this, no guarantee of outcome, no promise that it will be safe. The self-contained part of you resists this question not out of fear, but out of habit. And that's where the reflection stays, not in resolution, but in the quiet awareness that your strength may have formed in response to something that was never offered. And that understanding doesn't ask you to change. It just asks you to notice what you've been carrying alone.